Picture this. It's the year 722 AD. You're a general serving the Umayyad Caliphate, the unstoppable force that's just ripped through the known world like a blade. From the scorching sands of Arabia all the way to the Atlantic coastline, everything has fallen. Entire kingdoms have collapsed under your banners. You feel invincible. And then, a report lands in your hands. It's about a handful of rebels hiding in a cave somewhere in the mountains of northern Spain. Your scouts say they're starving, half dead. So desperate they're literally scraping honey off rocks just to stay alive. You don't order a siege. You don't even send a battalion. You laugh. And then you pick up a quill, and you write something history will never forgive. You call them 30 wild donkeys, and you say to your officers, "What damage can 30 wild donkeys possibly do to us?" That question is your death sentence. Because those donkeys are about to pull you into a slaughterhouse called the Battle of Covadonga, wiping out an army, sparking an 800-year war, and saving Europe from total conquest. But before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival, suffering, and impossible defiance, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe for more long-form deep dives like this. And comment below where you're listening from, because it blows my mind that people from all over the world are connected right now, exploring the same ancient story together. Now, to understand why this mistake was so fatal, you have to understand the speed the Umayyad war machine was moving at. This wasn't some slow, gradual expansion. It was a blitzkrieg. In 711 AD, just 11 years earlier, Islamic forces crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, and they didn't just defeat the Spanish armies, they erased them. At the Battle of Guadalete in a single afternoon, the Visigothic leadership was effectively decapitated. Nobles died, generals disappeared, the king vanished into chaos. Resistance didn't slowly collapse, it simply stopped existing. From that moment on, for Umayyad commanders, this wasn't even really a war anymore. It was cleanup. They swept north like wildfire. Cities like Toledo, Seville, and Córdoba fell one after another, almost casually. Many locals didn't even resist. They opened the gates, and the speed was intoxicating. By the time the invaders reached Spain's northern coast, they were convinced God himself was marching beside them. They had crossed seas, deserts, and mountains. Why would they fear some damp, foggy pile of rocks in Asturias? That's where the wild donkey's insult comes from. Because it wasn't just trash talk, it was a calculation. The chronicler Al-Makari records the attitude perfectly. The governor looked at the map, saw this tiny pocket of resistance tucked inside the Picos de Europa, and basically said, "Why bother?" Marching an army into those passes would be expensive, annoying. Winter was coming. Hunger would kill the rebels. Cold would finish them off. And if they wanted to live in a cave like animals, let them die in a cave like animals. But here's the detail the Umayyads didn't understand. They looked at the numbers, a few hundred rebels versus an empire of millions, and they completely ignored what those men were made of. These weren't peasants holding pitchforks. These were hardened survivors of the Visigoth royal guard. Veterans who had watched their kingdom burn and had retreated to the one place cavalry couldn't follow. And they were led by a man named Pelayo, a man who didn't want to just survive. He wanted revenge, and the Umayyads' arrogance created a blind spot. Military history is full of this exact mistake. It's the same blindness that destroyed Napoleon in Russia, the same blindness that dragged the Americans into Vietnam. When a superpower faces a guerrilla force, they look for armies, battlefields, open plains. When they don't see that, they assume there's no threat. The Umayyad generals wanted wide fields where heavy cavalry could charge and archers could dominate. They didn't find that in Asturias, so they assumed the war was over. They left the north alone. They let the donkeys live, and in doing so, they gave Pelayo the one thing he needed most: time. Time to organize, time to learn the terrain, time to turn a group of refugees into an ambush squad. While the Umayyads were busy counting taxes and preparing the invasion of France, Pelayo was transforming the Covadonga Valley into a kill box, and the irony is brutal. If the Umayyads had sent one serious expedition up there in 718 or 719, they could have crushed the rebellion in a single afternoon. They could have ended the Reconquista before it even began. Spain might be an Islamic nation today, but they didn't, because they were too big, too successful, and too arrogant to care. They treated Asturias like an infection that wasn't worth treating, until it became lethal. So when the order finally came in 722 to deal with the rebels, it was already too late. The Umayyad commander Al-Qama marched his force into the mountains, expecting a simple peace action, a surrender, a quick execution, a march in, a march out. He didn't realize he was walking into a geological trap. He didn't know those donkeys had spent years sharpening their hooves, and he definitely didn't realize he was marching tens of thousands of men into a grave dug by 300 ghosts. The stage was set for one of the most lopsided and violent clashes in medieval history. But to understand the desperation of the men hiding in that cave, you have to understand what they lost. Because the Islamic conquest of Spain is often portrayed as an invasion, but that's only half the truth. The fall of Hispania wasn't just a murder, it was a suicide. The Visigoth kingdom had ruled Iberia for over 300 years since the fall of Rome. But by 710, it was rotten to the core. A political shark tank, civil wars, assassinations, constant coups. There was no stable succession. Every time a king died, the nobles fought like animals to claim the crown. And in that chaos, they produced a king named Roderick. Roderick wasn't crowned peacefully. He seized the throne by force. He blinded rivals, imprisoned enemies, and made half the kingdom hate him. And in the shadows, his enemies were willing to burn the entire realm down just to watch him fall. Enter the man history remembers as the villain, Count Julian. Julian governed Ceuta, a fortress city on the North African coast. He was the gatekeeper of Europe. His job was to stop invasions. But Julian had a grudge. According to the most enduring accounts, he sent his beautiful daughter to the royal court in Toledo for education. And there, King Roderick saw her, took what he wanted, and dishonored her. When Julian found out, he didn't demand justice. He didn't declare war. He made a deal with the devil. He approached the rising Muslim commander Musa ibn Nusayr and his general Tariq ibn Ziyad, and he told them, "I will not only let you cross, I will give you the ships." It's one of history's coldest betrayals. The man hired to lock the door handed the keys to the burglar. And in the spring of 711, Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed into Iberia with 7,000 Berber troops, ferried on Julian's own merchant vessels, disguised like a trade convoy. And that is where Spain's world began to collapse. King Roderick, meanwhile, wasn't even in the south when Tariq landed. He was hundreds of miles away in the north, fighting Basque rebels when word arrived. An Islamic force had crossed into Hispania. And Roderick didn't panic. He didn't even fear it. He was irritated. Because to him, this looked like the same thing that had happened dozens of times before. Another raid. Another band of foreigners coming to loot, burn, and retreat. So he marched south to teach them a lesson. He gathered a massive army, 30,000 men, heavy cavalry, noble banners, the full weight of the Visigothic war machine. And on paper, he should have crushed Tariq's 7,000 invaders like insects. But paper doesn't account for betrayal. The two armies collided at the Battle of Guadalete, and at first, it looked like a normal fight. Until it wasn't. Because the wings of Roderick's army, commanded by relatives of the king he had overthrown, suddenly stopped fighting. Some sources claim they turned on Roderick. Others say they simply stood still and watched him die. Either way, the result was the same. The king was isolated and swallowed by chaos. Roderick vanished. His body was never recovered. The only thing found afterward was his white horse and his golden boots, sunk deep into the mud along the riverbank. And that moment, that single betrayal, broke the spine of the Visigoth kingdom. Because there was no heir, no backup plan, no unified leadership. The entire system collapsed instantly, like a building where someone suddenly removed the foundation, and the invaders didn't retreat like mercenaries. They looked around and realized something terrifying. The door to Europe was wide open, so they walked right through. What followed wasn't a conquest in the traditional sense. It was a free fall. The Umayyads advanced without supply lines, living off the land, taking cities like a tide swallowing sandcastles. And the population? Many didn't resist. The locals were exhausted, tired of Visigoth taxes, tired of corruption, tired of nobles assassinating each other while the kingdom rotted. And for the Jewish communities of Iberia, who had been brutally persecuted under Visigoth rule, the new Muslim governors often looked like liberators. Within 2 years, the Visigoth kingdom was a memory. The nobles who had betrayed Roderick were either executed or stripped of power. They had sold their country for a throne that no longer existed. And this is the world Pelayo lived through. Our protagonist. Pelayo wasn't some random peasant rising up with a pitchfork. He was a high-ranking nobleman, a member of the royal bodyguard, possibly even related to Roderick himself. He watched Guadalete unfold. He watched loyalty collapse. He watched friends slaughtered, leaders vanish, the entire country dissolve. And unlike most of the survivors, he didn't submit. He retreated north, step by bloody step, as the green tide of the Umayyad Caliphate swallowed everything he ever knew. By 718, Pelayo wasn't just a refugee, he was a loose end. And loose ends make conquerors nervous. So the Umayyads captured him and dragged him south to Córdoba, the new capital of Al-Andalus, keeping him as a hostage. But this wasn't a dungeon. It was something more calculated, a gilded cage. Because after the conquest, Umayyad's strategy shifted. It wasn't about slaughter anymore. It was about consolidation. They needed local nobility to keep the population calm. So they took the sons of influential families and brought them close. Not to kill them, but to domesticate them. To turn former enemies into obedient puppets. Pelayo was forced to live under the gaze of the new rulers, likely serving in some administrative role, watched carefully, never trusted. And while he was trapped in Córdoba, a different kind of conquest was happening in his homeland of Asturias. The Umayyad governor of that northern province was a man named Munuza, and Munuza was not a battlefield monster like Tariq or Musa. He was a politician, He preferred diplomacy, marriage alliances, quiet control. And he set his sights on one particular prize: Pelayo's sister. Accounts vary. Some say her name was Adacinda, others say it was different. Some sources claim the marriage was forced, others frame it as political. But the core truth doesn't change. Munuza wanted to marry into Visigoth blood, to legitimize his rule, to fuse the conquered royal line into the new order. And to Pelayo, that wasn't just a marriage. That was extinction. The genetic erasure of his family. The conqueror taking the last symbol of the old world and stamping it into the ground. So when news reached Cordoba that Munuza was moving to claim his sister, something in Pelayo snapped. The passive hostage died, and the rebel was born. In 717 AD, Pelayo escaped. We don't know the details. Maybe bribery, maybe disguise, maybe violence. But what we do know is this: he covered nearly 500 miles through hostile territory to get back north. And he wasn't running to save himself. He was running to stop a wedding. He arrived too late to erase Munuza's influence completely, but just in time to ignite resistance. Pelayo confronted the governor. And understand what that means. This wasn't a debate in a village. This was a fugitive openly defying the Umayyad Caliphate. Munuza ordered his arrest immediately. But Pelayo didn't surrender. He fought his way out. And this is where the legend begins. There's a famous account of Pelayo fleeing across the Nalon River. As Munuza's troops closed in, Pelayo plunged into the rushing water, clinging to his horse while arrows slammed into the river around him. He wasn't just escaping, he was migrating. Crossing from occupied land into wilderness, heading toward the only place Umayyad horses could not follow: the Picos de Europa. These mountains are not gentle rolling hills. They're a wall of limestone teeth erupting straight into the sky. Steep, jagged, brutal, constantly wrapped in fog. To the locals, they were home. To an invading army, they were hell. And Pelayo didn't go alone. As he moved through villages and valleys, people began to follow him. Visigoth nobles who had lost everything, peasants tired of taxes, young men who had grown up in the shadow of defeat. They saw something in Pelayo they hadn't seen in years: a leader who wasn't afraid. This ragtag band, these wild donkeys, followed him into the mountains. And there, in the cold shadow of the peaks, they held a council. No cathedral, no gold crowns, no incense, just desperation. Standing on a pile of wet stones, Pelayo was declared princeps, prince, not king of Spain, not ruler of Iberia, prince of the Asturians. To the rest of the world, it meant nothing. To Munuza, sitting comfortably in his palace in Gijón, it was a joke, a fugitive playing king in the woods. And Munuza made the fatal error. He let Pelayo stay. He assumed cold and hunger would do the job of executioners. He thought the mountains would kill them for him. He didn't realize that by driving Pelayo into the wilderness, he'd given him the ultimate fortress. For 4 years, from 718 to 722, Pelayo consolidated power. He wasn't fighting a war yet. He was building a nation in a cave, stockpiling weapons, scouting every narrow pass, learning every foothold, waiting. Because Pelayo understood something the Umayyads didn't. Eventually, they would come. And when they did, he wouldn't meet them on open ground. He would invite them into his house, into the dark, narrow throat of Covadonga, and he would slam the door shut. Because if you look at a topographical map of Spain, you'll understand why the Reconquista lasted nearly 800 years. The center of the country is a wide plateau, perfect for large armies. But the north? The north is a fortress built by tectonic plates. The Picos de Europa rise abruptly from the sea, creating a labyrinth of gorges, cliffs, and valleys. This is not terrain for horses. It's terrain for mountain goats. And the weather? The weather is its own weapon. Atlantic winds smash into these peaks, generating endless rain, fog, and snow. For an Umayyad soldier raised in desert heat or North African plains, marching into Asturias was like marching onto another planet. And that brings us to Covadonga, the place Pelayo chose for his last stand. The name comes from Latin, Cova Dominica, Cavern of the Lady, a natural cave carved into a cliff face, hanging above a valley where two rivers meet. A dead end, a geographic trap. To reach the cave, an army has to funnel through a narrow wooded gorge, a perfect force multiplier. The Umayyad army, commanded by General Al-Qama, was enormous. Christian chronicles claim 80,000 to 180,000 men. Modern historians suggest something closer to 10,000 to 20,000 effective fighters. But here's the thing. It didn't matter if Al-Qama brought 10,000 or 10 million, because in that gorge, only a handful of men could fight at once. And the rest? They weren't an army. They were a traffic jam waiting to die. Pelayo had built the perfect killing box, and in the spring of 722, the Umayyads finally marched in. They brought with them a special weapon, not a sword, not an archer, a man meant to break Pelayo psychologically before the fighting even started. A bishop. Before the first arrow was even fired, General Al-Qama decided to play his political trump card. He didn't send a warrior to the mouth of the cave. He sent a priest. Riding forward on a mule dressed in the ornate finery of his office came Bishop Oppas. Oppas is one of the most fascinating and most hated figures in early Spanish history. He wasn't some low-ranking clergyman dragged along for ceremony. He was high nobility, the son of a previous king, a prince of the church. But to the men starving inside that cave, Oppas was something else entirely. A collaborator. Oppas represented the faction of Visigoths, who had decided it was better to live kneeling than die standing. He had kept his wealth, kept his position, kept his head, all by bowing to the new masters in Córdoba. So when he rode up the gorge within shouting distance of the cave mouth, it wasn't diplomacy. It was psychological warfare. And the Christian chronicles, especially the Chronicle of Alfonso III, record the conversation that followed. Now, speeches written centuries later aren't always word-for-word reliable, but the soul of what was said is unmistakable. Oppas didn't threaten Pelayo. He tried to seduce him with logic. He shouted up to the cave, "Pelayo, my brother, you are a wise man. You know the truth of our situation. The entire army of the Goths, with all their strength, could not resist the Ishmaelites. Every great city in Spain has fallen. How can you, on this little mountain, succeed where a kingdom failed?" It was a powerful argument, and worse, it was true. Oppas offered him a deal. Come down, pledge loyalty, submit to Córdoba, and you can govern Asturias as a friend of the Caliphate. You'll be rich, you'll be safe, you'll have a future. And for the starving men inside the cave, shivering in the damp, hungry, and exhausted, that offer must have sounded like mercy. Why die for a kingdom that no longer exists? Why throw yourself into a hopeless war? Why not take the deal and live? But Pelayo's response changed history. He didn't answer with numbers. He answered with faith. Standing at the cave's mouth, looking down at the bishop who had sold his soul, Pelayo shouted, "Have you not read the Holy Scriptures? that the church of the Lord is like a mustard seed, the smallest of all, yet it grows greater than all." And then he said the words that became prophecy. "I will not associate with the Arabs in friendship, nor will I submit to their rule. For we rely on the mercy of God, that from this little mountain the salvation of Spain will arise." With that, Pelayo didn't just refuse surrender. He rejected the entire idea that the conquest was permanent. He declared it temporary, a storm that could be endured. Oppas realized words had failed. He turned his mule around and rode back to Alcama. His report was simple and chilling. "He will not surrender," he said. "You must fight, but only God knows what the outcome will be." Alcama barely reacted. He'd heard speeches before. He looked up at the cave, the cliffs, the ragtag rebels, and he didn't see a mustard seed. He saw target practice. He raised his hand, the drums began to beat, and the order went out. Slings and arrows. The vanguard moved into position, archers and slingers, ready to suppress the cave mouth so infantry could storm the slope. It was standard siege logic. It had worked 100 times. But as the first volley darkened the sky, the men below were about to learn a lesson in physics. Because Covadonga isn't a deep tunnel. It's a shallow overhang carved into stone. And when you shoot from below at a steep angle, if you miss even slightly, your arrow hits rock. And when a high-speed projectile hits hard stone at an angle, it doesn't lodge. It ricochets. The chronicles say, "The arrows returned against those who shot them." Medieval writers called it a miracle. Modern ballistics calls it geometry. The Umayyad archers were firing into a stone bowl. Arrows shattered and bounced back down into their own tightly packed ranks. Men screamed. Panic rippled through the front lines. Soldiers looked up in confusion, shielding their faces from friendly fire raining down like cursed hail. And in that split second, while the monster blinked, Pelayo gave the signal. From the cave, from the trees, from the ridges above, the wild donkeys charged. They didn't emerge like a polished Roman legion. They poured out like a landslide, men with swords, axes, and stones crashing into the stunned front ranks. But the 300 fighters in the cave were only the bait. The real teeth of the trap were waiting above. Because Pelayo knew he couldn't defeat Umayyad heavy infantry head-on, so he turned the landscape itself into a weapon. High on the ridges, hidden in fog and brush, villagers and farmers had spent days loosening boulders and stacking tree trunks. And now, as chaos erupted below, the signal was given. The ridgeline exploded. Massive rocks and timber crashed into the gorge, smashing into the packed army like the earth itself had decided to fight. Imagine the horror inside that valley. The Umayyads were shoulder to shoulder, trapped between cliff walls, with nowhere to dodge. The rear ranks kept pushing forward, unaware the front was collapsing. The front ranks tried to retreat, but the mass behind them pressed like a tidal wave. It became a crush. Men were trampled. Horses screamed and fell. The discipline that had conquered half the world evaporated in seconds. This is the brutal math of a killing box. In a space barely 10 meters wide, having more men isn't an advantage. It's a liability. Only the first row can fight. Everyone else is just waiting their turn to die. The Asturians moved through the chaos like wolves in a pen, striking from above, from the sides, from the cave itself. They targeted officers, banners, horses, anything that held the enemy together. And in the center of the maelstrom was General Alcama. To his credit, he didn't flee. He tried to rally his troops, tried to carve open space for a counterattack. But a general in a gorge is just another man on a horse. And the chronicles state that Al-Qama fell in the thick of the slaughter, cut down by the very donkeys he had mocked. His death was the final nail. In medieval warfare, the army is the general. When the head is cut off, the body dies. Word spread like electricity. Al-Qama is dead, and the will to fight collapsed. The Umayyad soldiers dropped shields, abandoned formation, and ran. But running in that gorge was just as deadly as fighting. Debris blocked the path. Reinforcements pushed into the bottleneck. The retreat turned into a rout, and this wasn't a battle anymore. It was an extermination. The Asturians weren't just defending. They were venting a decade of humiliation, grief, and loss. The river Deva was said to run red for days. By the time sunlight finally reached the valley floor, the invincible army was shattered. The survivors fled east through the mountain passes, desperate to escape. They thought they'd escaped hell. They were wrong. They were only entering the next circle. Because as the broken column ran through a place called Kos Gaya, the mountains delivered the final blow. The ground groaned. The slopes gave way. A massive landslide tore down the mountainside, not just rocks, but the mountain itself collapsing onto the fleeing army. The chronicles describe it with biblical awe. The mountain came down upon them and crushed them. Medieval writers claimed 63,000 died, likely exaggerated. But the truth remains. The expedition vanished. The river was reportedly dammed by debris and bodies, turning the valley into a graveyard. And this mattered more than the battle itself, because a defeat can be avenged, but an annihilation becomes legend. No survivors returned to Cordoba with a plan. No messengers came back with warnings. An army marched out and ceased to exist. For the Umayyad governors in the south, that silence from the north must have been terrifying. It created a psychological border. Asturias was no longer insignificant. It was cursed, a graveyard. So the Umayyads made a pragmatic decision. They would raid these mountains in the future. But never again would they attempt permanent conquest. And that landslide gave Pelayo something more valuable than gold: security, a permanent buffer, a chance for the mustard seed to grow. But Pelayo wasn't finished, because there was still one loose end: Governor Munuza. While the Caliphate's army was being buried in the peaks, Munuza sat in his palace in Gijón waiting for Pelayo's head. Instead, rumors arrived. Whispers of massacre, of mountains falling from the sky, of a ghost army that couldn't be killed. Munuza understood instantly. The game was over. The countryside was shifting. The locals, once passive, were now looking at him with something far more dangerous than fear: hope. Gijón was indefensible. So Munuza ran. He gathered treasure, guards, and likely Pelayo's sister if she was still captive, and fled south toward the plateau where Umayyad cavalry ruled. But Pelayo anticipated it. The rebels came down from the peaks faster than Munuza could travel Roman roads. They intercepted him at a valley called Olalis. And what happened there wasn't a battle. It was an execution. History is vague on the exact details. Killed in a skirmish, captured, executed. But the outcome is final. Munuza died fleeing a kingdom he thought he owned. And with Munuza dead, and Al-Qama buried, Asturias was free. A few weeks earlier, these men were refugees. Now they were victors. And for the first time since 711, there was an independent Christian ruler on Iberian soil. The warriors gathered, and according to ancient tradition, they lifted Pelayo onto a shield, raising him high, shouting his name. No gold crown, no cathedral, just battered armor and voices cracking with emotion. But that moment marked the birth of the kingdom of Asturias. A tiny kingdom, barely a speck on the map. A few valleys and a lot of rocks. But it was free. Pelayo made his capital at Cangas de Onís, humble compared to Córdoba's marble splendor. But it had one advantage. It belonged to him. And that coronation wasn't just symbolic. It was a political earthquake. It announced to the world, we are still here. The Umayyads, stunned by the loss, categorized Asturias as Dar al-Harb, hostile land not worth the blood. They turned their attention toward France, a choice that would later lead them to another disaster at the Battle of Tours 10 years later. Pelayo would rule for 15 more years, and in 737 AD, he died in his bed, a rare ending for someone like him. But his true legacy wasn't the crown, it was the chain reaction. Because Asturias should have died when Pelayo did. History is filled with rebel movements that collapse when the charismatic leader is gone. But Asturias didn't die. It grew. Because Pelayo left behind something stronger than an army, a template for survival. His successors learned the only way to live was to weaponize emptiness. They couldn't defend the open plains south of the mountains, so they created a shield of nothingness. Historians call it the desert of the Duero. Asturian kings raided south, but instead of conquering towns to rule them, they emptied them. Burned crops, evacuated Christian populations northward. They created a scorched earth buffer zone so any Umayyad army marching north would cross hundreds of miles of wasteland with no food or plunder, starving and exhausted by the time they reached the mountains. Perfect targets for ambush. Behind that buffer, Asturias incubated, a fusion of Visigoth nobility and mountaineer toughness. They built churches like fortresses. They wrote laws. They preserved identity while much of Europe sank into chaos. And over time, Christians from the south, tired of second-class life under Islamic rule, migrated north, bringing skills and stories and a hunger to reclaim. The Umayyads didn't see a threat. They saw poverty and rocks. They didn't realize the wild donkeys had evolved into wolves. By the 9th century, Asturias was pushing back. Its capital moved to Oviedo. The Reconquista shifted from desperate defense into slow, grinding offense. And this is the miracle of Covadonga. Not that 300 men won a battle, but that they bought enough time for a nation to be born. Because without Asturias, there is no Leon, no Castile, no Portugal, no Spain. And without Spain, history bends in ways we can barely comprehend. No Queen Isabella, no 1492 voyage, no Columbus. The Americas would speak different languages, follow different religions, and belong to entirely different empires. The modern world was pivoted inside that cave. But Pelayo didn't know any of that. He wasn't fighting for the future of the Americas. He was fighting for his home. The Reconquista he ignited would last 770 years, one of the longest wars in human history. And when Ferdinand and Isabella finally took Granada in 1492, they didn't see it as conquest. They saw it as completion. The finishing of a mission that began in 722. Today, you can still visit Covadonga. You can stand in the cave. You can hear the waterfall crashing below. And carved into the stone near Pelayo's tomb is an inscription that reads, "Here lies King Pelayo." It was he who, in this marvelous place, began a new reign that arose from the ashes. A humble resting place for a man who saved a civilization. But maybe that's fitting. Pelayo wasn't a man of palaces. He was a man of mountains. And his story reminds us that history isn't always shaped by vast empires or unstoppable armies. Sometimes, it's made by a handful of people backed into a corner, who look at impossible odds and simply say, no. The Battle of Covadonga teaches us that even when the map is painted in the enemy's colors, even when experts say all hope is gone, as long as one mustard seed remains, the story isn't over. A single spark protected in a dark cave can eventually burn down a forest. If you made it this far, you're clearly someone who values the deep, overlooked stories that define who we are. So if this story of survival and defiance hit you, please give the video a like. It genuinely helps these stories reach more people. Subscribe, hit the bell, and don't miss the next deep dive into history's turning points. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think the Reconquista was inevitable? Or was Pelayo's victory truly a miracle? Let the debate begin below. And if you want to understand what happened after the Reconquista, click the video on your screen right now to see how the Spanish Empire rose to rule the world and how it eventually fell. I'll see you there.